Welcome to Spark Creators, a podcast that empowers kids to learn, create, and become. This podcast invites creators and entrepreneurs from all over to share their stories and ideas. We believe every kid is creative. It's just a matter of taking that first step and starting now. We hope this podcast can inspire you to create something that makes a difference in the world. If you want to stay inspired, remember to subscribe. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play, or visit us at peachandplumlab.com/podcast.
Hello everyone, welcome to Spark Creators. I'm your host Li Zeng. Thanks for tuning in today with me. This is a very special timing where a lot of you, including myself, are staying home so much due to the coronavirus. My parents, they actually live in Hunan province in China, and it is just right below Hubei province, Wuhan city, where the virus originated, according to the news. So I have been constantly hearing updates about coronavirus since in the very beginning of the year. Luckily now, after a couple of weeks of staying home, the number of people getting affected has dramatically reduced in China. So a lot of people started to get back to work. But of course, they're still very cautious about keeping themselves safe. However, the problem now is that it has spreaded across the world, where a lot of people's life were really impacted due to the outbreak. In California, where I live right now, the government has made an announcement for staying at home since early March. So I have been working from home since months ago. Definitely, let's stay safe and keep the social distance needed to slow down or even clear up the spreads of the virus. Alright, so today I actually wanted to share with you guys about what have I learned from running this Spark podcast for a year. I started this podcast around March and April last year in 2019. Until now, it's almost 50 episodes, and this is the 50th episode. And I'm really, really excited that after a year that I get to this milestone. So it's very exciting, and there are a lot more episodes are in the pipeline, and I'm really excited to share this topic with you guys. So hopefully you can learn something in the process as well while you're listening to my podcast. So running a podcast definitely takes a lot more effort than keeping a blog, for example, because it has to involve other people like the guests and even some co-hosts in the beginning. So I will tell you a lot stories that's what I did earlier and then what I'm doing right now. And even though I know this is a personal effort where I am passionate about this topic, empowering young creators to create and become entrepreneurs, but I'm still not sure where this kind of impact would go. Actually, like how many kids and parents out there are listening, and if educators are interested in this podcast at all. I'm in it more for myself to learn and also expand my network in this educational field and to find a lot of awesome people that I can learn from and I can interview, at the same time inspire you guys. Alright, that being said, what did I learn running a podcast for a year? I'm going to share with you guys 4 points in this podcast. Number 1, overcome fear and judgment takes a little process. When I first started the podcast, I was actually afraid of running this show solely. First, English is not my mother language. Second, it is a podcast for kids and family, so I thought it would be nice to have some young host who speak English as a native to co-host the show with me. So I took some efforts looking for 2 co-hosts, middle schoolers and high schoolers, actually in the Bay Area in California, where I can see them and meet up with them, and so we can run the show together. Sometimes when we have 2 guests, like father and son team or a mother and daughter team come to our podcast, we ended up having like 4 people in one video chat, which can be a little chaotic, to be honest. Since I run the show, so my job is mainly contacting the guest and also preparing questions. That is the main part of my job. In the very beginning, I try to let the co-host to prepare their own questions too, but they're still in school and they have a lot going on, and it's actually really hard for them to come up with questions ahead of time and ask. So I actually wrote some questions for them to ask ahead of time for them. During the process, though, I learned that sometimes it's actually better for the host to learn the guest and to research and come up with questions that really relate to them. But due to the limitation of the recording device, when I first started, I actually drove 30 miles even per way to our co-host home or to their place every time when we conduct an interview. And that in the beginning lasted for 3 months, and that's why I totally feel in the very beginning was a full-time job to run this podcast. So as the podcast developed and I started to interviewing guests online with our co-host, still finding a time with the co-host and the guest is really, really hard. Yeah, just in general, finding a time that fit 3 people rather than 2 is harder than ever. So slowly I started to accept the fact that sometimes my co-host cannot join me all the time during every interview. So starting in 2020, early this year, I started running this show all by myself. In the process, though, I figured out that having co-hosts in the very beginning is actually totally giving myself courage to get started. I had fear doing this solely, and I am afraid, like you as listeners, sometimes maybe you will see mistakes or grammar mistakes or accents in my pronunciation. It's because English is not my mother language. Till today, I still find sometimes I make grammar mistakes when I make a sentence or have some kind of imperfect pronunciation when I did certain words. But I know it is not avoidable because I was not born here in the US. So the only thing I can do is to pay attention to those mistakes and note them down sometimes and keep like frequently practice them and then keep improving. So as a matter of fact, I know I have improved a lot since the very first episodes that I did. And my husband is a great help and he speaks English natively, so he would give me a lot of suggestions and also point out what exactly what my mistake is and how I pronounce things wrong so that I actually can note them down and pay attention in the future. So as a result, the more episodes that I do, the less fear I had now toward talking to others and express myself freely and with my second language. I know those grammar and accents actually matter maybe to a lot of podcast listeners, but I have the determination to improve it. Also, I truly believe the mission and the purpose behind this podcast, which is to empower kids to learn, create, and become, and empowering parents to support their own kids to be someone who they really want to be in the future. So that gave me a lot of devotion to keep doing this podcast, just keep interviewing guests. So that is the first thing I learned. Overcoming my own fear and others' judgment actually takes a little time. I might not be able to run the podcast solely in the very beginning, but now I am ready this year. So I attribute all those to my co-host and who has actually worked with me and helped me, supported me at the time when I really need that assurance and also encouragement. So thank you guys. And as you guys listen to my previous podcast, you know their name. They are Yang Gao and Jennifer Lee and Ria Merchandani. So I wanted to appreciate you guys and thank you so much for being there for me when I first started. All right. So the second thing I learned is that self-doubt is the biggest obstacle in achieving our goals. So to be honest, one of the biggest concern for an interview-based type of podcast is to find awesome guests. In the beginning, I limited myself only thinking about people whom I know already. So I listed a bunch of people who I worked with, like friends who I know, and people who I can talk to. As a result, it's actually not that easy to ask people around me to fill the criteria that I needed for a specific series of episodes. For example, when I was doing the series on study and become, I really wanted to find a student from a private high school in the Bay Area. I asked parents around and asked them if they know anybody, like anyone is going to Harker, which is a very competitive private high school in the Bay Area. And they either have nothing, they can think of, nobody they can think of, or they had nothing to share with me on the podcast. So I ended up searching online myself and found the exact person that I really wanted to interview. And if you guys have listened, that is the episode number 6, Ayush Alag, How to Solve a Real-World Problem as a High School Student. So through that, we had a great conversation on the topic related to solving a problem in high school, and also really devote your time into researching and make an impact with a simple problem that you found around you. Throughout the whole process of reaching out to different guests, I have grown from thinking my podcast is so new and only had a few episodes, and how would this kind of guest wanted to join my interview, to another mindset, something like, this is the exact person I am looking for, reaching out boldly and just plan to deal with the rejections. That kind of transformation came from me trying to reach to some very influential guests, and they actually ended up always agreeing to be on my podcast. So I started to think, oh my gosh, even this level of guest wanted to be on my show. Maybe my podcast isn't bad at all. So the series on change makers in education, that whole series really strengthened my belief on that, because the guests I booked are actually internationally known for their achievements in the educational field. So if you guys wanted to check out those episodes, that is episode 16 to 20. And I had invited Dr. Dennis Licky, who is the co-founder and co-director of the Math School. And he's the co-founder of Big Picture Learning. And also he's the president of College Unbound. And it's quite interesting that we ended up meeting in person in San Francisco, because he came for a conference that weekend. And it was funny, this morning I actually also chatted with Dr. Dennis Licky, and we became good friends whenever I needed someone to bounce ideas around, or I needed some suggestions when I have different ideas, and he's actually there for me. So I was really, really happy and also impressed that people like his level, could be part of my show, and also became friends of mine, and I can keep this relationship going. So another episode in the same series is from Dr. Yilun Li. She is the founder of E2 International School, and also she is the director of Bill Gates Foundation in China. And knowing her, it was an honor, and actually she agreed to come to my podcast. And we also met in person, and we actually shoot a video instead of just recording the episodes, which made me really think that what I'm doing is impactful and can also change people's mind, no matter how busy they are or how influential they are. So that gave me a lot of belief and strengthened my idea of keep this podcast going. And in the same episodes, episode 19, that was Larry Rosenstock. He is the founder and CEO of the San Diego-based High Tech High, a network of charter schools that is very popular actually in the U.S. So talking to him about project-based learning, it was an eye-opening experience. And also, episode 20, it was color visual, and we talked about the impact behind teacher of colors. So actually, I was able to invite people from various backgrounds and different race and diversity, and which I'm really proud that episodes actually came out as what I have imagined in the very beginning. So from then on, I stopped at the self-doubt thinking and just simply focus on one goal. What kind of guest would fit best for the series that I planned? Indeed, it is a very eye-opening experience since I shifted my mindset, and I'm just so astounded that how much my show has evolved since then. I know that the learning self-doubt is the biggest obstacles in achieving our goals. Sounds kind of cliche, but experiencing it through made me just a much better problem solver and overall entrepreneur and risk taker. So I hope everyone who is listening, that you guys are in the process of reaching your goals and can also learn something from your real experience as well. So the third thing that I learned from running this podcast for a year is simplicity also means efficiency. So in last year, I tried many different ways to run this podcast. I talked to guests in person. I tried opening the door actually to listeners as like a live podcast show on Zoom while recording the podcast. And I also tried to schedule with co-host at the same time, figuring out what our guest time would be. All in all, it was a lot to deal with when I made it very complicated. That's why back in October, I decided to take a little break last year and see how I can improve my current way of running the podcast. So starting this year in 2020, I decided to simplify the process of running this podcast. First, I reach out to guests in bulk and I move on to find replacement when people don't respond me or when they reject me. And then I use a tool called Calendly to ask guests to book the time with me. And I wrote down all the necessary tips and on the confirmation page. So actually I don't have to repeat the same email for every guest. And it becomes a very automatic process. And then I also made a promise to all the guests. I would send out questions to them before the interview, 1 or 2 days before the interview. And I have never missed sending one ever since because I made the promise. And those questions are actually really, really important for me as a host in this podcast to research about the guest and conduct a better interview. So the overall experience made me to learn about them and ask better questions. So at the same time, this really acts as a reminder for the guest, like 1 or 2 days before the interview, say, oh, your interview is coming up soon, so don't forget about it. So I think some guests in the past actually forgot the interview and didn't show up. So I think this is actually working great, sending out questions 1 to 2 days ahead of time. Lastly, I conducted the interview on the scheduled day and really enjoyed a great conversation with our guests. I added all the episodes together from the same series at a very designated time, mostly sometimes on the weekends, and that reduces all the pressure of publishing and editing the episodes very last minute before publishing. So it became a very smooth process where I bulk plan and bulk edit the podcast. I find it much relaxing and at ease when I know that some content that I have planned is 2 or 3 months ahead of my publishing schedule. So this type of simplicity brought me a lot of efficiency running this podcast, and I hope that can keep improving the process and make it even better in the future. So the I learned is never underestimate the power of consistency. I started this podcast mainly for two reasons. One, I wanted to keep learning, and two, I enjoy talking to people. On top of that, I hope these conversations can really inspire kids and parents and to help them to dream big and also take actions on their ideas. So personally, I have to say every conversation I had with the guest is a very eye-opening experience. My knowledge has expanded from kids' entrepreneurship to overall education for youth. For example, the next series we are going to talk about critical skills for young leaders, and a lot of this conversation I had with industry expert actually made me realize how much I am learning and how much I can offer in the future for my own kids as well. So including those episodes, and I also have interviewed parents and kids who are making very specific products for a very specific market. Knowing what I know now compared to what I know a year ago, it has been a very huge growth journey. So the only rule I have to set for this podcast is to keep the consistency, basically publish it once per week. And it is not easy to have a weekly podcast while working full-time as a product designer in Silicon Valley. There are a lot of difficulties finding guests, scheduling guests, and even have the time to publish and even promote the podcast. But I know it is the level of consistency that can bring me great growth and also with potential audiences in the future. And me myself, who has a background in user experience design, I know the importance of talking to end users, like the kids and parents that I intend to serve. So the podcast also becomes my kind of weekly user interview session with a lot of people who are from the educational fields and experts, and even customers potentially in the future. So I don't know how long I would keep running this podcast, but as my last point that I just made, never underestimate the power of consistency. Let's see what will happen once I get to another 50 episodes or 100 episodes and even more. All right, everyone, that is what I learned from running a podcast for a year, from 2019 to 2020, from all 50 episodes. I hope it's helpful for those who are wanting maybe to have your own podcast, or at least to let you know or get to know me a little bit better as the host. Or even just it's an encouragement for anything that you're doing right now, right? Overcoming fear and sometimes having self-doubt, but now you know that could be the biggest obstacles in terms of achieving your goal. And also when you do something, keep consistency and make it simple. And all those things are very basic, but I think learning from real life is very, very different. I know our show mostly are interviews with guests, so there's not a lot of chance that I can share my personal opinion or even just my own personality a lot of times in the show. So if you wanted to get to know me more or wanted to hear things like this, and simply go to the review in iTunes or Spotify and leave me a review. As I said, I don't know much about you. Either you are a parent or a high schooler or even a teacher who's there listening to this. I hope that you enjoy this show, and at the same time, I just wish I can know you a little bit more. I would appreciate if you spend some time, go to iTunes and leave me a review and tell me what you think. And if you have any other ideas I can bring into this podcast, I would highly appreciate it. All right, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I am your host, Li Zeng. This is a podcast that empowers kids to learn, create, and become, and a podcast to support teachers and parents to allow their kids to do bigger things than the dream. All right. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. I will see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Spark Creators Podcast at peachandplumlab.com.